Mormon Sex Info listeners, this is Lisa Butterworth, and today I am recording with Colette Dalton. Welcome, Colette.
Thanks, Lisa. Happy to be here.
Yeah, we've recorded quite a few together, but briefly, introduction, we are both Mormon mental health therapists, I guess.
Yeah.
And we are both sort of specializing, getting some training in sexuality. I am working on my PhD, and Colette is working on her certification in sex therapy. Is there anything else you want to add to that, Colette?
I think anything I'll add we'll be talking about in the episodes. So
excellent. All right, so that's who we are. And today we decided we're not going to talk directly about the talk that Elder Holland gave at BYU. There was if you're interested in some information or some talk from mental health workers about that, there's a recording that we'll put a link to in the comments that many of the providers at Symmetry Solutions did. Didn't you say it was about 3 hours?
Yep, it was a lot longer than I anticipated. We had stuff to say.
Yeah, so it's about 3 hours long. It may be added to the Mormon Sex Info podcast, but it's also available on Facebook if you're on Facebook, and we'll put a link in the comments. Anyway, but the topic today does kind of evolve out of that. Colette and I were talking, and we were talking about how, well, you frame it, Colette.
Well, another part of my introduction is I am gay myself and work in this Mormon and queer sphere with a lot of clients and personally. And it was really interesting for me seeing some of the rhetoric that people gave coming out of the talk, trying to be allies and be helpful, but it actually not being helpful. As a further frame, I have a small social media presence, and I channeled some of my emotions from last week into making an Instagram reel where I use the song where it's like, I get knocked down, but I get up again. And I used that and kind of showed how LGBTQ Mormons have gotten kicked down and gotten back up. And this was another example. And then I use that reel and put it over on TikTok where I have an even smaller following. And I was kind of surprised how the reactions, I'm not super familiar with TikTok. It's not somewhere I spend a lot of time. I feel like Instagram's more connection based and TikTok's a little more content, just reactions and things. But anyways, there were some positive reactions, some people saying, yeah, good job, keep fighting, whatever. But then there are a lot of people who obviously know nothing about me and my situation, saying things like, why are you still staying? This is Stockholm syndrome. It doesn't make sense. Getting out of the church was the best thing I ever did. Get out now, and things like that. And I want to validate their experience. I'm glad when people do what they feel is best for them. But for me, it's not that simple. So that's kind of what we wanted to talk about, is just that complication and intricacies, complexities around being queer in the church and why it's maybe not helpful to tell people to just leave.
Right. I feel like this is something I see all the time in my clients. And it's a reason I think why people will choose to come to somebody like us as a therapist, because often they get this not only from ex-Mormon therapists, but also maybe secular, people who have never been Mormon. Like there's just this kind of lack of understanding of like, if this does, if this is what's happening, why don't you just leave? And then that often just isn't helpful at all. Isn't helpful at all for my clients trying to navigate the complexities of the actual lived experience that they're having.
Right. It is complex. It is complicated. And, if we step even back from the Mormon and queer space, I remember I was talking to someone once and they said they felt really misunderstood and invalidated when they were going through a faith transition, and a friend said, well, why don't you just leave? Why don't you just go to a different church? And if you don't understand how Mormonism works, that doesn't make any sense, right?
Right.
You are assigned, in theory, if you follow it, based on your geographical home base, you are assigned a congregation to go to. You don't just pick another parish, another pastor you like, and go there. You're supposed to stay in these boundaries. So it's not that simple. And they were also talking about how, yeah, it's not just where I spend my Sundays, though. I can't just leave because it's my family. It's who I spend time with. It determines what I do during the week. It determines what I drink. It determines what I watch. It's so all encompassing in so many areas of my life because I grew up and it's just everywhere. I can't just leave. I get how maybe you, outside perspective, may think that that's the best course of action, but it's not that simple. I can't, because if I were to just leave, like in a lot of ways, I leave so many other aspects of my life, right?
Right. Like on a very human level, we are communal creatures, like on an evolutionary level, right? Like we are programmed to believe that like our survival depends on having a group of people that have our backs, that will protect us when the tigers attack, that will help us gather enough food to survive, right? Like we believe like on a really fundamental core level that like it feels like we're going to die if we don't have the support of our group.
Yep.
And to just tell someone, well, just leave, right? Like it actually, like I think, I mean, at least because I relate to what you're talking about with just having this be said in a faith transition. I relate to that. I remember people being like, well, what's the problem? Just go find a different church. And you know, like that's not really an option in Mormonism.
Yeah.
And also like everything I knew, everything I know, even now, even 20 years later, everything I know is pretty connected to the church.
Right. Yeah.
And sure, you can just leave and you're not probably going to die in this modern world.
Right.
But dude, like that's not really realistic for a lot of people.
Yeah, it feels that real. I talk to clients about that a lot, that evolutionary perspective that we need human connection and that belonging. If we were kicked out of our group, we would literally die. And I think evolutionarily it's still there. I was actually listening to an interesting podcast recently talking about the brain science about rejection, and it was just fascinating. And I think that is just something to be aware of, that it can feel very rejecting in this space. I've said before, and I'll say again, that I kind of joke that I'm too Mormon for the gays and too gay for the Mormons, right? And so it's like, where do I fit? Where do I belong? And that's hard. For a long time, when I was wrestling with my sexuality and spirituality, it really felt like I was going to have to cut off one part of myself or the other. There didn't seem to be a way for me to integrate. And people around me kind of enforced that idea by saying, well, just stay in the church and, you know, be single and that's fine. And people saying, well, just leave the church and be gay. And it felt very black and white, like I had to choose, like one or other part of me had to die, which led to some suicidality because like it didn't seem possible to kill off either side. So why not just die overall? Not to talk too lightly about it, but that's really how it felt.
Right.
And these people trying to be helpful by them inviting me to stay or telling me to leave, that wasn't helpful. It was super invalidating.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that applies even beyond just, you know, like I have had clients who, when they experience, you know, like I hesitate to use these words, but same-sex attraction in the context of being Mormon, right? Like, and that's how they label it, that then they will have people say, well, just label yourself a lesbian or just label yourself gay. And often that label really doesn't feel true to them either yet, or maybe it never will. Like maybe they're pansexual or maybe they're demisexual or maybe they're asexual, right? But there's still this pressure for, you know, like to label yourself in a certain like all or nothing way that like they're not given a chance to like sit in for themselves. And even that, you know, like, wait a second, right? Like, why are we pressuring people to make a choice and give themselves a label when that doesn't feel right to them yet, right? Like, can we trust people to take some time and sit in these experiences and figure it out for themselves?
Right. And it's so interesting for a church that believes in agency. I feel like we believe in agency unless you're using it wrong.
Right.
And so you kind of get that perspective from people inviting you to stay. And then kind of the other side of, well, leave, they're harming you, which I did feel harmed in a lot of ways, but again, it wasn't that simple because it was still a part of me. And how do you work that out? It's really, really complicated.
Right. And I think in the end, how you work that out is so individual.
So individual.
Right. And you thinking that you, doesn't matter who you are, have some answer for somebody else. Like, just label yourself a lesbian, just label yourself, like, just leave the church, just like, no, don't know. I mean, no.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing that we see a lot in the Mormon and queer space is so many times people holding up examples of other people saying, well, they did it, why can't you? Right. This is the one right way. And that's one thing I really appreciate. So often people who tell their stories do it with the disclaimer of, this is my story. Do not hold me up for an example for anyone else. This is just what worked for me and me telling my story. But so often that's ignored. And it's like, well, let's just point to these people who have their books at Deseret Book, or this example of this couple who got divorced so that they could be in the church because it was a lesbian couple. And people use those in a very, very toxic, unhealthy, unhelpful manner by saying it worked for them, so this is how you should do it.
Right.
But we know that everyone's journey is so individual. It's not going to work to have someone follow someone else's path.
Yeah. And I think that, like, what we're looking for when we do that is that we do long for, I think, that structure or that answer, that there's a right way to do it.
Right.
And, like, from the Mormon perspective, the right way to do it is, first of all, to not be gay.
Right.
But if you are afflicted, put that in big air quotes, then it is your cross to bear and just suffer, singleness forever, right? Like, there's this one right way to do it.
Right.
And then from the LGBT perspective, right, like, the run white way to do it is like, leave that all behind, forget those crazy Mormons, forget your family, just come and live your best gay life. And, like, if that is actually what works for you, I don't have a problem with that.
Go for it.
Right. But, like, neither of those narratives are necessarily helpful for the person in front of you.
Right. Religions in general, and definitely in Mormonism, there's very much a lot of black and white thinking, right? It's either this or this. You've got to either stay in the church or leave. And so many other examples we can go into maybe some other time. But I feel like a lot of people, when they leave organized religion, they don't leave that mindset behind. And so they still have that mindset of, I've either got to stay 100% in or I've got to be 100% out and swing to the other side of the pendulum. And I think that ignores how complicated, again, I keep using that word, but it is in the middle, in the gray. I had a kind of wake-up call a couple months ago. I was scrolling through Instagram, and I think it was the Mama Dragons posted something about how many different shades of gray there are. And I was like, wait a minute. I feel like a lot of times when I think, oh yeah, the gray's in the middle, so it's black, white, or gray. How many shades of gray are there though? I mean, not to reference the book or movie unless you want that, but like you have
there are 50 shades of gray, Colette.
I think there's infinite shades of gray though, because you have the very light silver, almost white, down to that super deep charcoal, almost black. And yeah, you have that medium gray right in between, but you have all the other ones all in between that. And I think that's kind of how people's lives paths are, is there's those infinite gray in between. It's not black, white, or gray. It's which gray, right? I don't know if that analogy made sense, but it was kind of, I don't know why that hit me so hard of like, oh yeah, there's different shades of gray.
I like it. And I think you can push that even further, right?
Mhm.
Like you can go into colors,
Sure.
right? Like that's the whole rainbow symbolism. And I think even you can call into question, and this is a big paradigm shift, like what is it with black and white, and why, like, sort of post Augustinian Christianity is very sort of like good and evil, black and white. But, like there are other ways of thinking about
Mhm.
the dark and the light, like as symbolized in like the yin and the yang, that like bringing them into balance. Like black isn't necessarily bad, like white, like we need
Mhm.
darkness. We need,
Right.
like we don't necessarily have to see darkness as being a bad thing, right? Like it just needs to be brought into balance.
Yeah.
And so even with 1,000 shades of gray, there's also just like there's the whole paradigm shift that like a darker shade of gray doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, right?
Right. Right. We're not assigning any moral value to any of this, just recognizing the infinite possibilities. And when you tell someone just leave, when you tell someone to just stay, keep trucking, endure to the end, that can be so invalidating of all those infinite possible paths that work for that individual.
So I think one thing that like I had to learn in like therapy school and in learning to sort of step away from thinking that I know what's best for other people is that, like being raised Mormon, I was definitely raised with just a thinking habit, right? Like a way of thinking about the world in which there's a right and a wrong way to do things, and you should figure out the right way. And, and so I think that habit, that thinking habit, definitely translates and becomes the thinking habit of, like sort of the ex-Mormon thinking. It's just like they just flip, right? Like we can start thinking like there's still a right and a wrong way to do it. And the wrong way is now the Mormon way, right? Instead of that being the right way. And I think that like moving away from that paradigm altogether, it's really hard because especially, right, like if you're out and you are experiencing all this new freedom and you see all these positives and you feel so judged, right? Like you feel so judged by your family and you've absorbed a lot of pain. Right, like you've experienced some really shitty things along the way. And here you are, like having made this really hard decision, and there's some real positives to it, like a lot of, like freedom and getting to know yourself. And then there's this other side of this, like probably social rejection and loss of social capital and loss of connection to family. And like you've experienced that. And it's really easy to look back and be like, oh man, even though this hurts and this sucks and I've been wounded, boy, did I make the right choice, right?
Yeah.
It's really, really hard to see someone in a place where you feel like you've been and see the way that it maybe limits them, or, not to put it through the lens of your own experience and judge it that way, right? Like, it's really, really hard to like step back yet another step and say, just because I'm glad I made the choice I did the way I did, doesn't necessarily mean that that's the quote right choice for the person in front of me.
Right.
And that's a really big paradigm shift.
It
especially
is.
Yeah, especially if someone's in pain and you think you know the answer to fix it, right? It's really hard to step back. And this is the point I want to get to. Almost always, generally speaking, I think, probably, do I need any more conditionals there? Most of the time, I think the answer is human connection. and you're thinking that you know what's right for them and giving them advice about what they should do, destroys the connection. And that is a hard thing to step away from. Like, it's hard to step away from this idea that, like, oh, I know what they should do, and instead say, you know what matters here is that I validate their experience, and that they know I love them, and that they don't feel judged by me, and they don't think that I know better than they do. Even if you really do think that you know better than they do, like, it takes some real humility to, like, step back and be like, well, maybe I don't know better than they do.
And I think the vulnerability that's required to listen to someone is something that we need to recognize, because to truly listen, you've got to have some empathy and some ability to try to see from their perspective, which might challenge your worldview a little bit, right? Because their experiences have led them to the point that they're at, just like yours have led you to where you're at. And they're different experiences. And so if someone's opening up about why they're on the path they're on, that could challenge where you're at a little bit. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think it just requires vulnerability to sit with someone and listen to their story.
Right. And not to judge it. And not only vulnerability, which I think is real and hard, but also, you know, like, a different set of skills than the ones we were raised with.
Right. And learning to sit in that ambiguity, because it's not as easy as primary answers all the time for everybody.
Yeah. And, like, what is that? I mean, what does it look like? Like, how do you move through the world? I remember this so clearly coming out of Mormonism, of, like, not even knowing how to move through the world without thinking that I'm right or wrong.
Right. Yeah, everything seems to be like a moral judgment sometimes.
Right? How to even view the person in front of me without trying to determine whether they're doing the right or wrong thing.
Right. That's tough.
And even myself, right? Like, maybe even tougher sometimes. And again, it's not that I want to believe that everything everybody does is okay. Obviously, that's not true. But, you know, like, it's one thing to recognize, and this is the tool I like for this, is moving toward this idea of, we still have to make judgments in the sense that, like, we need to be able to set boundaries, right? We have to know what our values and goals are so that we can set boundaries. And those are fine judgments to make. And then we have to make judgments about whether our behaviors align with our values and our goals, and whether it's effective at getting us towards our values and goals. Like, are the things I'm doing effectively getting me toward my values and goals?
Oh, and that's so tricky, because I work with so many people who don't know what their values and goals are outside of Mormonism and what they've been told their values and goals are.
Right.
Like, that's a thing I do with a lot of clients is, hey, let's figure you out. What do you actually believe? What are your values? What do you want to do with your one wild and precious life?
Right. And I think that that's, like, a much better question to ask somebody that you're concerned about. Like, well, what do you want for yourself? What are your values and goals? Right? Then you should just leave the church, or you should just stay.
Right. Yeah, the most helpful and validating things people did was acknowledge that it's hard and just sit with me as I figured it out. And they didn't encourage me one way or another. They knew I was on my own journey to figure it out. And I think we all are still figuring it out to some extent. And they just let me be me, right?
Right. And boy, like, is that hard to do?
So hard.
When somebody you love is in pain, to just, like, sit back and not try and fix it.
Right.
It's so hard.
It is. It is.
But then, like, then we have to sit with like, who am I that I think I could say?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, and I think it's a good question to ask. Like, why do I think I have the answer? Why do I think saying, well, just leave the church? Like, what kind of grandiosity does it take for me to think I have the answer for somebody else's life?
Right.
And yet, like, that is a hard, scary thing to do, because you're letting go of the idea that you have the answer and you can fix things,
Mm-hmm.
and it kind of throws away like the checklist and the container.
Mm-hmm.
I know that for a lot of my clients, that feels really unstable. It feels really, like, well, wait, if I don't know what's right, which kind of goes back to, like, exploring your values.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure what else I have to add. Just, I think one thing we really wanted to highlight with this is it's complicated, right? Just don't impose your values and beliefs on others. It is hard. I don't know what else you have to add, or if you had examples you wanted to share from your clients of this space.
Yeah, I mean, I think the things that make it complicated would be an interesting thing to talk about, because it's so different for different people, right? Like,
Right.
for some people, it revolves around, I mean, I would say for most people, there are heavy elements of like family.
For sure.
Like, how will my family respond? How do I give them time to come around if they're going to come around? Like, how do I break this to them easy? Or, like, sometimes in some families, it is never going to feel safe to disclose. So how do I live my life without disclosing this to my family?
Right.
Or, like, do I, like, what do I need to do to get myself safe so that, like, I can take care of myself? What tools and resources do I need in order to, like, make a new group of people who can be there for me if my family is going to reject me? And then how do I process that rejection? There's so many complicated family things.
Sure.
But it's not the only thing. Like, there's identity things, right? Like, some of my clients are just very, like, they're totally gay, but they're also very orderly people. And the church is a very orderly place. And there's something about that match of like my intuitive orderliness and the orderliness of this church that gave me this checklist, and, like, that feels some kind of way. Like, I've had clients where their families were actually very accepting of their gayness, but they didn't want to be gay because their perception of like becoming gay meant that, like, I had to go out and live this debauched lifestyle, right? Like I just want to get married and have children and live a very Mormon looking life, but like gay, and that, like, there was this, like, I had a client who, like, her parents strongly encouraged her to stop going to church because they could see how hard it was on her, and they didn't want that for her, but she insisted on continuing to go because she didn't want to be like a bad lesbian person, and it wasn't her family at all.
Right.
Like, so, like, the issues are really kind of complicated. So there's identity things, and then there's also like spirituality issues. Like, there are people who genuinely feel connected to God in the Mormon context. And they don't necessarily want to or can't feel the same kind of connection in other places.
Right.
And, like, that's a really difficult one because, like, if you're a spiritual person, and that's a really important part of how you identify and how you move through the world, and Mormonism is the place that has defined your spirituality and your relationship with God, like, that's hard for people who aren't spiritual to really understand. But I mean, like, my take on it is like, I feel like I'm somewhere in the middle. Like I
Mhm.
really love spirituality. I dig it, but I don't feel it in my core the way some of my clients do.
Mhm.
But I also have clients who like just don't like it at all. Like they're not interested in a spiritual journey or a spiritual connect. Like that's just not their thing.
Right.
And I think those are all valid ways of being.
Mhm.
But like that in and of itself can be a huge complication for my clients where like,
Right.
and another one is children,
Mhm.
right? Like
Mhm.
I have children who I feel like being raised Mormon was really good for me in a lot of ways. I really liked the structure. I really liked the community. I really liked, and I want to raise my children in this community.
Mhm.
Then there's like marriage relationships. Like, yeah, I'm gay, but I'm also married to someone of the opposite sex. And we have a really good relationship and we're best friends and we're great co-parents. And, like there's
Mhm.
just, I mean, I feel like I'm, like still at the tip of the iceberg, but
Right.
like these are just the common things that come up with my
Mhm.
clients.
Mhm.
I think the people who, and this would include me probably at one point in my journey, but those of us who have experienced that belief that like I have the answer and you should just boom,
Mhm.
right? Like that there is some deep paradigm work that we need
Yeah.
to do to move away from the idea that like we need to fix this, we need to have answers, and toward how do I support the people I love and how do I really be there for them without judgment. That's
Yeah.
my sort of.
Well, that was one of the biggest ahas, or I guess paradigm shifts in grad school. I remember one of my professors said, as a therapist, your job isn't to tell people what to do. And I'm like, wait, what? Like, starting grad school, I thought that's what therapists are supposed to do. They're supposed to tell people what to do with their lives, right? That's why people come into therapy. And the professor continued and said, no, your job isn't to give them answers, because if you give them answers and they like it and it works, they become reliant on you. If you give them advice and they take it and it doesn't work, then they blame you. Either way, they're not taking responsibility for their own life and their own actions. Your goal in therapy as a therapist is to provide them space to figure out their own answers.
Right.
And I think that's a big life lesson for all of us, not just therapists, is to allow people the space to figure it out on their own. Of course, people may go to others for advice. They may look at others to see what possibilities there are, what paths they might take. But ultimately, they've got to make their own decisions, and us telling them what to do or what not to do ultimately isn't helpful.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a good place to close.
Okay, then.
Colette, thank you so much.
Yeah,
I love talking to you.
I love talking to you.
I hope that our listeners enjoyed this session. If you have any feedback, leave it in the comments. And we strongly encourage you, if you are listening, to donate a little bit to the Mormon Sex Info podcast so that we can pay our lovely editors so that they can get these out to you in a timely manner. We appreciate you guys following along with us in this discussion, and let us know if you have any questions.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too. But through every storm we traveled on like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary. It's nothing hard.